Hello, welcome to 6.06, the challenges of globalization 1. This is the very beginning, so we're starting with slide 1. To its supporters, globalization is a positive trend because a globalized economy brings strong economic growth and an increase in the overall standard of living. Free trade results in greater specialization, which increases competition, lowers prices, drives innovation and efficiency, and provides consumers a greater diversity of choices. Critics of globalization accept many of these general claims, but believe that the process is harmful because it is driven by narrow economic interests. The benefits of globalization are unevenly distributed, and it causes hardship for poorer countries. Critics also point out that some of the world's biggest problems, such as poverty, human rights violations, and climate changes, are made worse by globalization. Others say that a globalization takes jobs from wealthy countries and moves them to poor countries where workers toil in misery for wages so low they can never hope to escape poverty. The forces pulling the world closer together are only getting stronger. Advances in production, transportation, and information and communication technologies are occurring by leaps and bounds. The spread of free trade policies and increasing capital mobility are drawing markets into closer interdependence. But globalization also poses many risks to nearly everyone, from the least developed to the most economically advanced countries. Whether countries open up to trade and the forces of globalization, they surrender substantial power. The rapidly shrinking world keeps forcing people into tighter interconnectedness, causing disruptions and distress. The pain of globalization affects some groups more than others, but it's felt across the globe. What are some of the potential hazards of globalization? Economic development. Rapid changes and unequal economic power can lead to radically unequal development. Labor rights. The mobility of investment and jobs can enable companies and countries to exploit workers. Environment. Lack of world environmental standards can increase pollution, global warming, and ecological damage. Human rights. The profit motive can get companies to look the other way when governments violate human rights. Terrorism. Cultural and political disruptions can spur on terrorists to attack the forces they feel are undermining their worlds. Economic development. One of the biggest concerns raised by critics of globalization is the problem of economic development. Economic development exists where there is a sustainable increase in a population's standard of living. In an ideal world, all countries would have a high level of economic development and nobody would live in extreme poverty. All human beings would have the means to meet their basic needs and more. The truth is, however, that only a small fraction of the world's people live in countries that are developed economically, and the gap between the least and most developed countries grows wider every year. Currently, less than 15% of the world's population lives in developed countries, while more than 100 of the world's countries are classified as developing. New versus non. Proponents of globalization claim that increased free trade and the expansion of the global economy will ultimately eliminate poverty. But is this true? Are underdeveloped countries actually assisted by globalization? The answer is that some are and some are not. There are about 24 developing countries making substantial progress towards economic development as a result of globalization and internal reforms. This group, often called the new globalizers, has experienced a dramatic increase in international trade, significant economic growth, and reduced poverty. Meanwhile, about 2/3 of developing nations remain on the margins of the globalization process. While they are not completely untouched by globalization, they're considered non-globalizers. In countries that are non-globalizers, the average annual economic growth declined from 3.3% in the 1970s to 1.4% in the 1990s. This group, which includes the world's poorest countries, includes more than 2 billion people. While the group of new globalizers includes fewer countries than the non-globalizer group, it contains more people. This is primarily because both China and India are new globalizers, and together they contain some 3 billion people, nearly half the world's population. So, if you measure by population, globalization is helping a significant portion of the world. But if you measure by the number of countries and the area of the world covered by them, globalization is making things worse. Sudan, an economic snapshot. Each non-globalizer has a unique story, and a lot can be learned about globalization by looking at particular countries that remained outside the trend. Watch this slideshow to see some of the reasons why globalization is passing by Sudan, one of the world's non-globalizers. Globalization and development. It is important to consider the impacts of globalization as it relates to these three distinct groups: developed countries, new globalizers, and non-globalizers. Test your understanding of the traits of different kinds of countries by sorting each feature into the appropriate category. The free trade bind. Advancements in economic development go hand in hand with participation in globalization, but many developing countries are out of the loop of global trade and falling farther behind. Free trade is one of the driving forces behind globalization, but free trade puts many developing countries in a bind. Without globalization and the investment it brings, they are unlikely to develop much further. At the same time, their young industries usually are not very efficient or competitive, and removing trade barriers does not help industries grow if they cannot compete in the global marketplace. This means that the global spread of free trade policies rarely benefits newly industrializing countries unless they can make rapid leaps in productivity. Another problem for developing countries is the irregularity of free trade agreements. WTO agreements have succeeded in reducing tariffs in many areas, but rich countries continue to use tariffs and subsidies to protect the labor-intensive industries in which developing countries can be the most competitive, such as agriculture and textiles. If developed countries had to lower their trade barriers on agricultural and textile products, developing countries would have a chance to boost their exports and grow their economies. These uneven protective policies help explain why it's difficult for many developing countries to take advantage of globalization. Developing nations continue to be at a serious disadvantage, and free trade leaves them farther and farther behind as the global economy explodes. Shifting labor patterns. Globalization also has a big effect on the lives of workers, bringing a mixed bag of benefits and problems. On the positive side, globalization leads to new jobs in some developing countries where labor is plentiful and cheap, and where infrastructure and industrial development are adequate. These countries are able to attract foreign investment if their governments have fewer restrictions on business activities, which many of them do. However, globalization also causes jobs to leave developed countries as businesses relocate operations to lower-cost areas. Unless governments and businesses in developed countries make the necessary adjustments to absorb displaced workers into new jobs and enterprises, high unemployment can result. Jobs of a different color. Globalization also contributes to changes in the types of employment worldwide. In developing countries that are globalizing, the main trend is a shift from agricultural work to industrial work. Jobs in the newly industrializing economies are concentrated in manufacturing, which requires lower skilled, manual, labor-intensive work, such as in apparel manufacturing or consumer electronic goods assembly. Jobs are also cropping up in the information technology sector, such as in customer service and technical support, in areas like India where education levels are high and English-speaking skills are strong. In developed countries, on the other hand, the number of industrial jobs is declining as processes become more automated and low-skilled jobs are sent overseas. But the number of jobs in the financial, service, and high technology sectors in these countries is on the rise, which helps offset unemployment, at least for those who have or can get the education necessary to hold these jobs. Meanwhile, workers in the least developed countries stay stuck in primary productive activities such as farming, mining, and fishing, where wages and opportunities for advancements are both low. Unemployment around the world. According to the International Labor Organization's World of Work Report 2013, There are 200 million unemployed people worldwide in 2013, a number they predicted would rise to 208 million by 2015. Unemployment rates were highest in the poorest countries and lowest in the new globalizer countries. For example, the unemployment rate in China was 4.1% in 2010, while the people of a non-globalizer country like Sudan experienced an unemployment rate near 20%. The working poor. In addition to shifting patterns of employment, globalization affects workers' earnings, though not necessarily by increasing wages. While job creation in the developing world is happening quickly, poverty hasn't been erased in those areas. Nearly half of the people with jobs live on less than $2 a day. This presents the problems of working poverty, in which people work full-time but do not earn enough to escape extreme poverty. Even where globalization is increasing the number of jobs, most jobs do not pay enough to lift workers and their families out of poverty. There are also effects on lower and middle wage workers in developed countries. Because of increasing international competition for manufacturing jobs, wages in developed countries have stagnated or declined. The power of unions has decreased as employers can respond to collective bargaining power by moving jobs to countries with weak worker organization or no unions at all. All right, we are going to end this recording on slide 11, and we will pick up on slide 12. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.